building tendon health for greater core strength and stability. So I've talked about static and dynamic stability in a previous video or in a previous tutorial. Now I'm going to start talking a little bit more about the anatomy that makes dynamic stability happen. And we have to include fascia and tendons in it. And mainly we'll talk about the tendons because a very simple example is the Achilles tendon and running. So what we're going to do in this tutorial is we're going to talk about tendons, what they are and how they work. We're going to apply it to some exercises, and then I'm going to show you how, as I'm doing that, I'm going to show you how core strength and stability develops the tendons, which then assist the muscles to make the whole system that much more stronger and that much more stable. If you want to build your core strength and stability, click the link below. You'll go through to my How to Build Core Strength and Stability 12-week program, which takes you from beginner up to advanced in 12 weeks. So what happens at the end of the 12-week program, which is a beginner's program, it then opens out into the intermediate and advanced programs where you're then able to use different bits of equipment, like I'm going to be showing you in this tutorial, and doing similar exercises as I'm doing in this tutorial as well. So if that sounds like what you want to do, click the link below. Number one, what is a tendon and why is it involved in core strength and stability and exercise and muscles working? Well, a tendon is what joins the muscle to the bone. It's a very fibrous tissue, and in some respects it acts like a spring. So if I take the Achilles tendon as the example, well, in fact, if I take the whole lower leg as an example, and if I use running as an example, or even skipping as an example. So what happens is I'm going to jump, like if I was skipping, I would jump up and then I would land. So I would jump up and land. Now, same as in running, if I'm striking with the front part of my foot, what happens is the calf muscle, the Achilles tendon and the plantar fascia essentially are acting like a spring. So as my foot hits the floor and my heel goes towards the floor, that's me priming that spring. So if I grab one of these bands here, grab this red one, and if I just use this bit here, as my foot hits the floor, my calf muscle and Achilles tendon will lengthen. And then, once the foot comes off, it springs back and then the foot comes off the floor. So the muscles and the tendons are working together to give you that bounce. And that is a very efficient way of moving. If we aren't using our tendons and our muscles and this elastic nature, what we're not doing is moving efficiently. So I talked about the smoothness of movement. Now we're expanding on that, and then we're making that very smooth movement, which is efficient in and of itself, and we're making it even more efficient because now we're not just using muscles, we're now using other tissues like the tendons and like the fascia. Now, because we're talking about core stability, we're talking about all the tendons that are around the hips, around the shoulders, and around the spine. Now, there is fascia because you've got fascia across the abdominal wall as well. So all of this is working towards building an efficient way of using the core, so you're able to move more weight, become more efficient in movement, but also protect the spine and protect the structures within it from injuries, aches, pains, and tightnesses. When it comes to improving the tendon and the fascial health, there are two things that we need to do with the exercise. One thing is create elasticity, and then the second thing is eccentric loading, which I'll explain in the next part. But first of all, we need elasticity. So as I mentioned with this band, we need to create muscles, tendons and fascia that are like elastic bands, so they move and spring back. So we start doing that. So what we need from that is a degree of speed to the movement. So we need to add speed into the movement. So if you watched my How to Build Static and Dynamic Core Strength, there was speed involved, and this is the reason why. And the reason why is because we want to develop this elasticity to the muscles. So what that means when it comes to the exercise is when it comes to the exercise and the weight that's involved, generally it needs to be a light weight that moves fast. So one easy example is taking this kettlebell and throwing it over my shoulder. Not letting go of it, obviously, but throwing it over my shoulder. So I go from this position and then up and over. So I'm moving it faster, which is putting more load on the body. But because I've learnt from the static and dynamic stability how to hold that position, this is why this is a bit further on. This is more in the intermediate and advanced stages. But what we're doing is we're going from here. Now there's nothing wrong with just holding everything tight, bracing and moving it a bit slower. Nothing wrong with that at all. Because again, we're learning the skill. We don't want to be erratic and get pulled around by the weight, because that's not really doing anyone any favours. What we want is a bounce to it. So we're in this position, we're here, and then we're moving it nice and fast. That takes a degree of control to be able to do that. Now obviously there are more exercises than that. It could be sort of throwing it up. So what we've got, when we're going over the shoulder, we're working diagonally, because what wants to happen is this hip and shoulder want to come apart. They will start to do that, but as we decelerate the exercise and slow, or the weight, and slow it down, and then pull it back down, that's the elastic band. That's the elastic band going apart and then springing back, going apart, springing back, going apart and springing back. This is why we need to develop it in this way. Obviously, if we go the other way, it's like that. When we go over the head, it's doing it in sort of straight up and down. So we're loading the tissues in different directions, which again is how we can then create some degree of stability, because we've got good elasticity in all directions, because we've trained it. So we need to be able to move the weights in all these different directions to develop the elasticity in all these different directions, which is going to make your core strength and stability that much better. The second component that we need is what's called eccentric loading. Now, eccentric loading, in a very simple sense, is when the muscle's lengthening under tension. So if I use the example of a bicep curl, that, when the muscle is shortening, the bicep is shortening, that's known as a concentric contraction. When you let it go back down, but you do it slowly under load, so you don't just let it flop, when you do it slowly and controlled under load, that's known as an eccentric contraction. So that again is what we need to create at the torso, at the shoulders, at the hips, so on and so forth. And again, kettlebells are a great way of doing it. You can do it in other ways. So a very simple other way, using a cable. So I'll go through the cable first and then we'll talk about the kettlebells. Now, you may have seen me perform this exercise in other tutorials, but basically the eccentric loading, so that would be the concentric loading. What we've then got is as we lengthen, so we start lengthening under load, pull back down and lengthen, pull back down and lengthen, pull back down and lengthen. Now that's a very controlled way of doing it, so that's a good place to start. So if you've watched any of my tutorials before, I'm all in favour of starting simple and then building more difficulty or complexity into exercises. So that would be a nice simple and easy way to start. That's a more complex exercise in and of itself, but with complexity there are more complex ones. So another one might be taking this round and then catching at the top, because that moment is a little eccentric contraction which my body's got to control, because what my body wants to do is go backwards like that, but I'm not letting it. So there's a little eccentric contraction that goes across here as I catch and then brings it back, goes across here as I catch and brings it back. The same will be happening at the shoulders. There'll be a little eccentric contraction to slow it down, and then we've got to come back down. So what we've got to be able to do is bring these types of components into our exercise, because if we've got good tendon health, we've got good muscular health, then the whole system is going to be much more effective. With all of that, that's going to bring better fascial health, because the fascia, again, because they're in what do they call them, like train tracks, they're in lines, they're essentially our whole body elastic bands. And then the muscles are just smaller elastic bands within these greater elastic bands. And again, as I've mentioned, that is the most efficient way of moving. It's also a very healthy way of moving, because then all the tissues are working. If we're just lifting weights like a dumbbell press, that's much more movement, much more load on just the muscles and not the tendons. What we need to do is start to complete the system, get the muscles, the tendons and the fascia in, and we're able to do that with that type of eccentric loading, because the tendons come online and react to then bring it back down. So to quickly summarise, we've talked about tendon health, why it's important. We've talked about exercise, core training, and exercises that incorporate this tendon health. And we do it in two ways: by developing elasticity to the exercises and also some eccentric loading. Obviously, the exercises that I've used are quite similar, but it incorporates these two components because we get the spring and we get the eccentric loading that comes back and springs it back as well. And then what that's doing, that's bringing the muscles, the tendons and the fascia online, which is going to give you much more effective core strength and stability than if you're just training the muscles. So what we've got to do is start adding some speed to it, which is then going to give us that elasticity and the eccentric loading. If you like this content, please do hit the like button below. If you found something useful or you've learned something, I'd like to know what that is. Leave it down in the comments below. Even if you've got a question, ask it in the comments below and I'll do my best to answer it. Also, hit the subscribe button and and the bell icon, and you'll be notified when I release my next tutorial. So many thanks for watching. My name's Chris. I'll speak to you in the next tutorial.